And I'd also like to acknowledge that where I am, I'm in Canberra, in Ngunnawal Ngambri country, and I want to pay my respects to the elders of this beautiful piece of Australia. I'm not going to be talking specifically about First Nations issues today, but I am going to be talking about the way in which social experience and social suffering sort of gets inside the body. And I think we have a huge amount to learn from First Nations people in that regard, how to think about that, how to address it. So I know, honour and respect that form of expertise. I'm going to share my screen for slides, so you will all disappear from me, which is always a weird, feels like you're jumping off a cliff. But let's go, have some illustrations. Great, share. Play from start. Great. Is that okay, Molly? Can you see?
Yes, that's great.
Great. Okay, thank you. So this paper is called Translating Epigenetics in Pregnancy, Switches, Books and Punctuation. And Molly's just mentioned this team, but here we are again. So this is work coming from a project funded by the Australian Research Council, led by Catherine Mills, who's from Monash Bioethics. And these are all my beautiful collaborators. And specifically here want to call out to Kylie and Jackie and Rebecca, because they are really the co-authors of this paper. Although they haven't seen the slides for this particular version, but this work is collective work that we've done, and particularly Rebecca's done a huge amount of work on collecting up all the materials and helping us write the actual paper. This paper is, a version of this paper has been submitted to a journal, as under review at the moment. So this is a study of the translation of epigenetics into antenatal care in Australia. I'm not going to spend a vast amount of time explaining epigenetics, partly because I'm guessing a lot of you already know something about that, and partly because I want you to have the experience, if you don't know about epigenetics, I want you to sort of feel what it might be like to be one of the people that we're trying to study, which is someone wanting to have a baby or having a baby in Australia, and how they might find out about epigenetics. So this kind of feeling that you don't really know what it is a feeling I want to cultivate inside you. So I'm not going to start by telling you what it is. However, you may already know that this is an emerging science, and it's seen as a very exciting part of scientific research at the moment, which is trying to show that environments, which could be very broadly conceived, anything from physical environments, social environments, and internal organs or ways of bodily processes, how those shape the expression of DNA, and therefore, big black box there, what the therefore means, current and future health, possibly intergenerationally. Epigenetics as a science articulates the biological mechanisms for things like the impacts of smoking and other drugs on fetal and long-term health, of diet and weight and stress, and how they affect development and long-term health. It's a very interesting field, and there's been some really great social science research on this, because it resonates with other ideas that are circulating culturally at the moment about inherited trauma. Some of the work that's most well known in broader culture is work about the Holocaust and Holocaust survivors and the children of Holocaust survivors, and how their health and bodies carry some of the history of that, their parents and grandparents suffering. The Dutch winter famine, another classic study of the impact of famine on the long-term health of the children of the people in famine, and also First Nations people, as I mentioned at the start. So our wonderful Australian colleagues, Kaval, Maloney and Warren, have been doing some really fantastic work in that space. These ideas of epigenetics also have really interesting long-term resonance with popular imaginings of mother-to-child transmission of health risks. Sarah Richardson's really fantastic American historian has written a beautiful book called The Maternal Imprint, in which she goes back many centuries and looks at ideas about how, for example, a mother seeing a disabled person while she's pregnant affects the health of her child. So she goes through that history and connects it up with epigenetics in a really interesting way. So I just want to mention that work. So why is a translation of epigenetics into prenatal care important? Well, there's lots of mays and coulds and mights in this slide because, well, as I'll say in a minute, at the moment we're finding that not much translation is occurring. When we wrote the bid, we thought there might be more than there is. So that's a sort of interesting space. But of course, epigenetics, as I've just described it, may well in the future have important implications for maternal health care, and new interventions based on epigenetic science may be developed in the future. These could be based on new understandings of biological mechanisms. That's what a lot of the science is trying to research, and or ideas about the significance of eggs and sperm and uterus so-called quality, and the importance of birth experiences and or the life history of parents. So all of those are things that are being studied at the moment, and which there's emerging knowledge, but nothing very stable at the moment from what we've been studying. Of course, this translation of epigenetics, and this is a core part of our overall project, may also reshape parental responsibilities, and perhaps particularly of birth mothers. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that later. It may change the work of midwives and others in maternal health care. And it has interesting and possibly significant implications for IVF, gamete donation, and surrogacy, because it may change how we understand egg, sperm, and intrauterine experience. So this is potentially pretty important. So our project is an interdisciplinary project. It's kind of an interesting conversation between social science and bioethics. And that's always a really interesting place to be, because we have lots of things in common and lots of different ways of talking about them. So we're constantly trying to translate so we understand each other. So there's a whole really significant strand of philosophical analysis, which I won't be discussing here because that's not my area of specialty, but there's a big focus with Catherine Mills and two of the PhD students on maternal responsibility. That's ongoing work. Then the textual analysis of publicly available materials. This is what I'm going to be talking about today, materials for people wanting to have babies or with babies that we've been doing up at ANU and at UNSW. We've also been undertaking in the sort of social science side of the project qualitative interviews with scientists, and we did those last year. We spoke to, it's about 25 scientists working in epigenetics, and we're almost completed another batch of 35 interviews with people working in maternal health care and policy in that space, which has been super interesting. This year, we're going to be also doing some structured group discussions with new parents. So we're sort of covering that whole space much we want. Some key preliminary spoilers. Scientists have widely divergent views on the field. So we could have kept interviewing, I think, for another 50 people and still not got a very clear understanding of what epigenetics is or what people think the significance of the science is. It's a very divergent, diverse field at the moment, partly because of its newness, I think. And also, this has been super interesting. Maternal healthcare workers that we've spoken to know almost nothing about epigenetics. This is not a term they recognise, or they might have a vague idea what it's about, which is not to say they don't do any work in this space. They do a lot of work in this space and a lot of careful work, but they don't call it epigenetics. So that's been a really interesting finding, and future work will describe that in more detail. But we started with texts because ethics approvals to speak to human beings take a really long time to approve. So you can start working with text at the beginning of a project. And we came across in looking for materials that women might, or women and men and all others might access if they were thinking about having a baby. And we saw this picture in an article about epigenetics we found online of this baby fetus that looks like it's smoking. We traced it back doing an image search to this campaign, which is from Essex Council and the UK, hard-hitting, quote-unquote, anti-smoking campaign from 2017. I just want to really briefly show you a tiny bit of this. It only goes for a few seconds. You can't hear the soundtrack, I think, but it's got scary music,
We
sort
can
of
hear it.
sad, scary music, and also a heartbeat. Okay. Oh, sorry. I don't want you to do that. So I just want to put that there because I find it such an evocative and troubling image that was reused, as I said, in an article about epigenetics. And we've found so much in talking to maternal healthcare workers that smoking is such an important part of their practice and trying to convey to women the risks of smoking for fetal development. Again, not talking in terms of epigenetics, but just thinking about the potential harms that could happen to fetuses. It's also very evocative to me as a feminist theorist of science and technology because there's been so much feminist work about the ways in which fetuses are represented and the politics of fetal representation. And I think that takes us really quickly into this point here, which is sort of the underlying argument of this paper, that it really matters the way in which public representations of scientific and medical knowledge use images, metaphors, and analogies to do the work of translating scientific and medical knowledge for general understanding or for the purposes of education or persuasion in that case. So it matters what images they use, what metaphors they use. And when I say they, I mean both scientists who produce this material and journalists and others who are involved in this translation. It matters because what the words they use and the images they use, the analogies they use carry meaning. And for us as social scientists trying to understand the science, this gives us insight into the assumptions and the affects or the feelings involved in those scientific and medical fields. So it's not only about, that there's science and then it's translated into others. We're sort of reading back from those images what we can understand about the way in which the science is framed and its scientific questions are framed. There's a very, very rich tradition of work in feminist work in this space, as I've said, and also in science and technology studies in this space and the history of science and technology, and particularly work around pregnancy and genomics. So there's a lot of work, as I said, about the fetus, but also representations of the genome. And I've just mentioned some of the key people for me in that space. So in this work on genomics, there's some very repetitive images that I use. And this is, I just did that really classic thing, when you do your PowerPoint slide and it says, do you want to find an image for this slide? Yes, please. Search online, Bing comes up. First images I get are these kinds of images. And I say images of the genome. We see this sort of beautiful, shining, twisted double helix, this strangely doll-like human. I guess that's supposed to be a human. Looks more like a cyborg to me. And then again, this other image of the book of life and the work of Greg Myers, Adam Hedgecoe, Evelyn Fox Keller have all highlighted the significance of this idea of the book, the representation of sort of futurism and understanding and the sort of glowing truth, I guess we see here, but also this very, very long set of letters that we need to kind of understand. I'm sure these are culturally recognizable to you. If I do the same thing with epigenetics, interestingly, the double helix is still here in both cases, but we're getting quite a different picture straight up. No longer this kind of mystical beauty, but rather something that speaks to questions of intergenerationality, which you can see in the top picture, and interestingly, a woman looking across this DNA as somehow connecting us across intergenerationally. And then down the bottom, this incredibly irritating picture to me, which is from Harvard. So this is not sort of trashy public education. This is high quality education from very renowned university, which is showing the sort of ways in which lifestyle, cycling versus smoking, get attached to the double helix. Literally, pieces of pizza and cigarettes get attached to double helix and end up with the fit mum with her fit, healthy kids, or, the overweight mum flopped on the couch with, I guess those children are supposed to be unhappy, sitting cross-legged as if they're at school. So there we go. So what did we do? We did this part of the project. We thought we're going to search online as if we are Australian people looking to understand pregnancy and fetal health. And we're looking for where epigenetics arises in that material. So Rebecca and I did quite a lot of searching, and we produced this archive of 71 texts from a variety of sources, including websites for pregnant people and parents. And a lot of these are very sort of mum-based. There's not so many that are directly aimed at fathers, unsurprisingly. We also looked at online news sites and popular science media, and also what we're calling explainer sites and videos made by scientists and clinicians. So it's important to think about the authors of these kind of texts are quite different kinds of people. Some of them are sort of alternative health practitioners, quite a lot of them actually. Some of them are journalists, and some of them are scientists or clinicians working in this space. We did a very detailed, quite complicated sort of analysis of these, classifying them and looking at who they're citing and looking what metaphors and figures they're using and what their understandings of epigenetics are, particularly around fetuses and pregnancy. And now I just want to show you some of the findings from that analysis. So I don't think this will be any surprise, but the first theme is hype. So like genomics in the early 2000s, epigenetics has been surrounded by a lot of hype over the last 20 years. Although we're noticing there's some more critical voices emerging in the last 5 years. So the very more recent stuff, it starts to feel that maybe epigenetics isn't living up to the kind of hype that was originally, the excitement that it was originally surrounded by, as happened in genomics, those of you who remember that far back know. So here's two quotes, one from a sort of general science-oriented magazine and one from a magazine, a newsletter for psychiatrists, introducing them to the idea of epigenetics. And the top one talks about epigenetics is proving we have some responsibility for the integrity of our genome. Jertel, who's a scientist, says, before genes predetermined outcomes. Now, everything we do, everything we eat or smoke can affect our gene expression and that of future generations. Epigenetics introduces the concept of free will into our idea of genetics. In the Psychiatric Times, they say, in a historical moment in which physico-chemical explanatory models enjoy unprecedented cultural cachet. Oh, hello, someone's calling me. Hello, can you silence your thing, please, Belinda? Epigenetics can empower patients through biomedical recognition of the importance of their lived experience and the role they have in shaping the course of illness. Epigenetics might allow patients to shed the stigma and internalize shame of psychiatric illness. So here we can see this incredible set of wishes and hopes that epigenetics might be able to make a huge difference to the way we live and the way that we manage our health, both our own and our future generations' health, and indeed will, help us express free will. So this extraordinary kind of power that this new science is supposed to give to patients and to potential mothers. We'll be able to act in ways that control our destiny. So moving on to metaphors and analogies, which I said before are sort of super important in understanding science. So there's a really great study by Stelmark and Nerlich from 2015, in which they reviewed articles published in The Guardian and The Times from 2008 to 2013, and argued that the launch of the Human Epigenome Project in 2003 and the subsequent development of epigenetics basically relied very much on existing metaphors of genomics. And what they did was borrow these metaphors from genomics, the book of life, what I mentioned before, the idea of the blueprint, musical metaphors about the orchestra, and recipes and cooking, and sort of repurposed and re-energized these pre-existing metaphors to try and help people understand, what the connection between the epigenome and the genome is. So our analysis took a much wider range of texts into consideration, and obviously added another decade onto Stelmark and Nerlich's work, but found pretty much what they found, that these key metaphors borrowed from the field of genomics are still what is used in public representations of epigenetics. And what these key metaphors or analogies do is they emphasize and produce DNA as something inert and passive, and the epigenome as something active. So there's this is a key example. Genes are the recipe for life. The epigenome is the way it's cooked. So again, thinking of the musical one, they'll say things like, DNA is a musical score, epigenome is the way that the music is played. So this kind of constantly differentiating the DNA and the epigenome and differentiating that into two categories, the passive and the active. The most common metaphor in all of these is the idea of the switch. And when we interviewed scientists, almost all of them, when we said, can you tell us, how would you explain epigenetics to other people? Almost all of them used a switch metaphor. So here's one from Mama Care, which is a website for people having babies, obviously targeted at women. They say, if we think of our genes like a light switch, each gene can be turned off, on, or dimmed. I should put a dimmer switch, sorry. And epigenetics is the mechanism through which this happens, with environmental factors such as diet, stress, and other exposures all affecting the epigenetic process. Another website says, a natural health website says, can we change our DNA health destiny with the flick of a switch? This idea that you can flick switches or you can dim them, again, conveys this idea of control and of activity, that the DNA is sort of just there and we can do things. It's a very, very simplistic metaphor. Obviously, there's off and on. And it made me think about, well, how do switches, what else are switches besides light switches? And I was talking to my partner who knows a lot about computers, and we're talking about central processing units, CPUs, which have many, many, many switches, right? This is what happens inside a chip. And I was like, show me a diagram of that. So each one of those little things is a switch. And I think perhaps if we want to, go with the switch analogy, maybe we need to think of something more like that, because the level of complexity in as far as we understand from talking to the scientists, of thinking about how many switches there are and how switches are connected to each other. If we want to go with switches and epigenomes and DNA, we might need to start thinking a bit more like that. I was Googling for images of switches, and this is the one that comes up the most often, which is the Nintendo Switch, which is a very familiar object to me as the mother of a son who very much loves his Switch. And I thought maybe there's an interesting thing about thinking about the complexity of pushing all those buttons and the sort of frenetic energy of, playing on your Switch. And I thought maybe this is an interesting analogy to think about epigenetic science, or maybe even pregnancy, that we're sort of, supposed to be pushing all these buttons and managing this incredibly complex world that unfolds within a real Switch. Another analogy that comes up a lot, as I've said, is this idea of the book. So here, this is from explainer video from a very well-known scientist working in this space in Australia. And she says on this in the video, genetics is our DNA, and that's the blueprint of life. Seeing that idea again. So if you were to put the sequence of that DNA, that blueprint, as letters in the book, then that's what we term genetics. It's reading our book of life. This is a blueprint. What then is epigenetics? Epi means above. And what we mean by that, it's translating the book of life, translating the code so we can actually understand what we are reading. Otherwise, it's just a series of letters. So this idea that there's just the letters, and we see these immense stream of letters that somehow can be made into something meaningful, often gets translated as one book, like there is the book of life. And I was starting again to think about what's sort of underneath this and how might we think about this in a slightly more complicated way. Thinking, well, what about a library of books? Because we're not just a book. One book isn't enough. There's not one book of life, clearly. And then I started thinking about this is the Amazon warehouse. You know, how many books are there in the world and how complex is their relationship to each other? Because the problem with this idea, and there's been, again, lots of really critical, interesting feminist work on this, thinking of Evelyn Fox Keller's work in particular, is that the idea of a book massively underestimates the complexity of DNA, let alone epigenetics. You think there's, you know, just doing numbers, there's 10 trillion cells in a human body, which means there's 10 billion miles of DNA in any one person. Right. So the level to think of this of reading is actually almost impossible because we cannot even begin. It'd be like reading all of those books many, many times over in an Amazon warehouse. It's not really a possible thing to do. Someone told me there's an interesting analogy saying looking at a little piece of DNA within the whole of a genome is like trying to understand a city through looking at a door handle. I find that an interesting kind of idea. Oops, let me go forward. The final one I want to talk about is punctuation and sticky notes. And again, this is about working with these kind of letter or reading analogies, which of course come from the idea that we use the letter names of each of the chemicals on DNA. And it's this, if DNA is like the alphabet, again from Harvard, epigenetic marks are like accents and punctuation. Or another one, if DNA is like a book, you know, epigenetic marks are like sticky notes. And this came up in another explainer video that we saw from the Max Planck Institute where they said, oh, sorry, it's not a video, it's an article. It's almost like the mother leaves sticky notes with instructions on where to find the food or who to call in an emergency and so on when the child is home alone for the first time. Interestingly, this is a discussion of fly mothers. So I'm not sure whether fly mothers actually probably do that. But so the analogies are quite hard to follow, but this idea that somehow that the mother does these actions that somehow point to parts of the DNA that should unfold. So read this, ignore that. And that there's a sort of active process of unfolding. So I'm up for time. Good. So the question for us then is to think about what kind of, I'm going to call it cultural freight here. That's just a sort of phrase I like to use. But what do these analogies and images carry? What do they convey that might impact readers' ideas, and how do they also work back into shaping the science? I'm not going to answer that question now because that's some future work, but thinking about what do they carry forward for readers. As I've said, there's a sort of simplified machinic quality to some of these metaphors, the light switch, and it's sort of as if there's just one light switch that's just off and on, although the dimmer idea does appear also. There's lots of emphasis on linguistic or word-based meaning making, this idea that we read and make sense of, that somehow renders the epigenome and the genome legible and understandable. And I think that sort of flows into an idea of the possibility and indeed the desirability of control. And it gets very confusing if you start to think about these analogies about who the actors are in any of these representations. So who's doing this control? Who's reading and who's being read? How does biological, internal, cellular action relate, or how do the chains get set up between human action, in the world and these cellular activities, and how does lived experience and biological experience speak to each other? And there's a huge amount of complexity being sort of skipped over really in these analogies, referred to but yet skipped over. And I think that opens up quite an empty space in which we can project ideas about the desirability of control and the idea that we can read, or we can be conducting the orchestra or cooking the recipe. In these representations, and this takes us back to the smoking fetus, as I think of that representation I showed you earlier, and then this image here, there's this sort of quite alarming representation of what I'm calling intergenerational trouble and harm. And this comes up particularly around smoking, but it also comes up around diet and stress, most particularly. That the message of epigenetics is that a mother is a potential threat to her fetus, and indeed to her fetus's child. And you can see that represented here. The smoking mum ends up producing this an overweight grandchild. So that is a really important cultural trait that, as Sarah Richardson's work shows, builds on pre-existing ideas about the ways in which women are responsible for the outcomes of their pregnancies. Brings me on to the third theme of our analysis of these texts, and this is the one that's really important to the philosophical people in our study. So I'm not going to talk a lot about it because they've got a whole nother, they do a lot of work on this, really great work on this, and hopefully they will present in this seminar at some point, this work. But in these popular accounts, we see these new responsibilities being produced for parents, and mostly mothers, although not entirely, to take care of the fetus's epigenome in order to produce future health. So we have headlines like, beware, child more likely to use drugs if mum smoked when pregnant. So some of these, like the one I showed you at the beginning, are very much about warnings and really being very direct about these are things you should not do because we now understand better what the harms will be. On the alternative side, and this is the second one there from another parenting website, it's comforting to know that we can have a positive influence on our health right now, our longevity, and the health of future generations by choosing a lifestyle with optimum nutrition, exercise, sleep, physical activity, minimizing exposure to pollutants. So there's this is the kind of positive spin. It's good news. You're not the result of, DNA is not destiny. You're going to be able to act in good ways that will help your fetus and child have a good life. So that's, responsibilities can be negative, to not do bad things, or I don't know whether that's the right word philosophically, but positive responsibilities to do the good things. So it works both ways, both of which can be daunting responsibilities. So to finish, online texts about epigenetics and the use of analogies and images and sort of logics in their discussion are, I think, shaping contemporary understandings of pregnancy, motherhood, and parenting. In contrast to earlier genomic discourses, which advised parents to consider the risks of passing on genetic conditions, but did not task them with influencing their DNA, epigenetic discourses endow parents and prospective parents with complex and confusing biological and technoscientific responsibilities to grasp the actions of the epigenome, to understand the entanglements of biosocial world, so how the social life and the biological life come together, and to act with care for future generations while understanding and attempting to ameliorate the effects of the past. So that's all quite a lot of hard things to do. While it may be reasonable, of course, to support prospective parents to adopt as healthy a lifestyle as they can, to attempt to stop smoking or taking other drugs, to seek personal safety, even to eat as well as they can afford to, parents cannot realistically or indeed justly, I would argue, be made responsible for managing the unfolding implications of epigenetic science for their children and future generations' health. Finally, perhaps as epigenetic science unfolds and the complexities of epigenetic action are better understood, and this is me sounding like I'm a progressivist, but I do think more understanding will develop, we might collectively, and I'm hoping the we there is scientists, journalists, and social scientists, including feminists, might be able to come up with some more adequate analogies, I hope, to convey the complexities of this scientific work and understanding of bodies, and thus to reframe or reshape understandings of health-related responsibilities in ways that are less likely to, do what these images do, which is to produce women as profoundly responsible for their children's futures. And this is, I think, the sort of core aim of our project, to be able to have some input into this reframing and to start a conversation with people like you about how that might happen. So thanks very much for listening.